Starfleet service is framed as the pinnacle of human achievement. Officers wear the uniform with pride, serve on vessels that carry the Federation's values across the galaxy, and return home with stories that define entire generations. The official narrative promises purpose, discovery, and a place in history. But there are assignments within Starfleet that strip away every element of that promise. Not through enemy fire, not through spatial anomalies or warp core breaches. Through institutional design. These are roles where survival is guaranteed, where the body continues, where the record shows an officer still in service, but where agency, identity, and moral clarity are methodically erased. The Federation does not execute its own. It does not need to. It has built positions that achieve something far more sustainable. It preserves the body while extinguishing the person inside it. The mechanism is not punishment in the traditional sense. It is reassignment. It is the quiet transfer to a posting where decision-making authority vanishes, where contact with the outside world becomes controlled, where the duties are so monotonous or so morally corrosive that the officer becomes a function rather than an individual. Starfleet calls this continued service. On paper, it looks like career progression or necessary rotation. In practice, it is a form of institutional burial. The officer remains alive, remains employed, remains logged in the personnel database. But the conditions of that service make it impossible to leave, impossible to grow, and often impossible to reconcile what the uniform is supposed to represent with what the assignment demands. The Federation does not need to court-martial every officer who becomes inconvenient, unreliable, or politically problematic. It simply moves them, and the roles it moves them into are designed to last. This is not about danger. Danger implies stakes. It implies the possibility of victory, escape, or a clean end. The assignments Starfleet uses to neutralize personnel without formal punishment carry none of those possibilities. They are built to sustain indefinitely, to extract function without requiring consent, and to ensure that the individual inside the role becomes irrelevant to the system's operation. What makes these assignments worse than death is that death ends, these do not. They persist across decades, across treaty changes, across shifts in Starfleet doctrine. The officers assigned to them continue. They file reports, they follow orders, they remain in uniform, but the person who first accepted that assignment is gone long before the body stops breathing. The pattern becomes visible when the system is examined not by its ideals, but by its outcomes. Starfleet maintains a network of installations, monitoring outposts, administrative hubs, and support facilities that exist far from the frontier. These are not exploration vessels. They are not diplomatic postings. They are logistical anchors, intelligence relays, and bureaucratic processes. The Federation requires these facilities to function. It requires personnel to staff them, and it requires those personnel to remain in position long enough for institutional knowledge to accumulate and for continuity to be maintained. The official justification is operational necessity. The reality is that many of these postings function as pressure valves. When an officer becomes inconvenient, when a commander's decisions attract the wrong kind of attention, when a crew member witnesses something Starfleet cannot afford to have discussed publicly, reassignment to one of these facilities offers a solution. The officer is not discharged. They are not imprisoned. They are simply moved into a role where their influence, their voice, and their autonomy are quietly erased. The first category of these assignments involves long-duration isolation postings. Starfleet operates monitoring stations along the borders of Federation space, many of which are staffed by skeletal crews for years at a time. These stations observe subspace traffic, track potential incursions, and maintain sensor grids that feed data back to Starfleet Command. The work is essential. The conditions are brutal. Officers stationed at these outposts spend months or years in environments where communication with the outside world is limited to scheduled reports, where rotations are delayed due to budgetary constraints or logistical complications, and where the duties themselves are so repetitive that the human mind begins to erode under the weight of monotony. On screen, Starfleet rarely discusses these postings in detail. When they appear, they are framed as temporary hardships or necessary sacrifices. But the personnel records tell a different story. Lieutenant Reginald Barclay's assignment history, revealed across multiple episodes of The Next Generation, shows a pattern of transfers to positions where his social difficulties and technical obsessions could be contained. While Barclay eventually found a functional role aboard the Enterprise D, his initial postings placed him in environments where interaction with senior officers was minimal and where his work could be isolated from broader crew dynamics. This is reassignment as damage control. It is not exile in name, but it achieves the same result. The officer is moved to a position where their presence does not disrupt the larger system. The difference between Barclay and others in similar circumstances is that Barclay had an advocate. Many officers do not. When reassignment occurs without intervention, the posting becomes permanent. In Deep Space Nine, the station itself begins as a form of institutional exile for Benjamin Sisko. Starfleet assigns him to oversee a derelict Cardassian mining platform in the aftermath of the occupation of Bajor, a posting so politically fraught and operationally marginal that it appears designed to end his career quietly. Sisko's trauma following the Battle of Wolf 359 makes him a liability in the eyes of some within Starfleet Command. The assignment to Deep Space Nine offers a solution. It places him in a role where failure can be attributed to impossible conditions, where success can be reframed as luck, and where his influence on core Starfleet operations is effectively neutralized. What Starfleet does not anticipate is that the discovery of the Bajoran wormhole transforms the station into a strategic asset. Without that discovery, Sisko's posting would have remained what it was designed to be, a professional dead end disguised as a necessary command. The cost of these isolation postings is not measured in casualties. It is measured in what the officers lose over time. Contact with the outside world becomes ritualized and limited. Social networks erode. Skill sets narrow to the specific technical requirements of the posting. Reintegration into standard Starfleet operations becomes increasingly difficult. The officer becomes institutionally stranded. Reassignment to another posting requires justification, and that justification is rarely provided when the officer's current role is still being performed adequately. Adequacy becomes a trap. As long as the officer continues to file reports, continues to maintain the equipment, continues to follow protocol, the system has no incentive to move them. The posting is working, the officer is not. The psychological mechanism is erosion. Not crisis, not breakdown in the traditional sense. Erosion is slower. It is the steady reduction of decision-making opportunities until the officer stops expecting them. It is the narrowing of social interaction until the officer stops seeking it. It is the repetition of tasks until the tasks become the only structure the mind can rely on. Starfleet does not need to actively punish these officers. The assignment does the work. And because the assignment is framed as necessary service, because it is logged as continued duty, the officer has no formal grounds for complaint. They are still in uniform. They are still contributing. The fact that they are no longer fully human is not something the personnel system is designed to measure. Isolation is one mechanism. Administrative burial is another. Starfleet maintains enormous bureaucratic infrastructures to manage personnel, logistics, diplomatic correspondence, treaty compliance, and operational coordination. These infrastructures require officers to process requests, review reports, adjudicate minor disputes, and ensure that the machinery of the Federation continues to function. The work is essential. It is also invisible. Officers assigned to administrative roles at Starfleet headquarters or regional coordination hubs often find themselves in positions where their expertise is irrelevant, where their decision-making authority is limited to procedural approval or denial, and where their contact with active exploration or defense operations becomes non-existent. This is reassignment as neutralization. The officer is removed from the field without being discharged. They are placed in a role where their experience is wasted, their skills atrophy, and their ability to influence Starfleet's direction is reduced to filing reports that are rarely read. The mechanism here is not isolation but irrelevance. The officer continues to work. They continue to receive assignments. But the assignments themselves are designed to be repetitive, low stakes, and procedurally constrained. There is no opportunity for initiative. There is no room for creativity. The role is a machine, and the officer is a component inside it. Over time, the officer stops thinking of themselves as an explorer, a diplomat, or a defender. They become an administrator. And once that identity shift is complete, the reassignment has achieved its purpose. The officer is no longer capable of returning to the field. They no longer want to. The system has converted them into something it can use indefinitely without resistance. On screen, Starfleet headquarters is often depicted as the pinnacle of career achievement. Officers speak of assignments there as prestigious. But the reality is more complex. The officers who thrive at headquarters are those whose skills align with political maneuvering, protocol management, and institutional navigation. Officers whose strengths lie in field operations, tactical improvisation, or exploratory science often find themselves sidelined in roles that demand none of those capabilities. Captain Edward Jellicoe's temporary command of the Enterprise D in the two-part episode Chain of Command reveals how Starfleet uses reassignment to manage officers whose command styles are too rigid, too inflexible, or too politically inconvenient for long-term vessel command. Jellicoe is an effective officer. He is also abrasive, uncompromising, and tactically focused. Starfleet uses him when it needs those qualities. When it does not, he is reassigned to positions where those qualities can be contained. The posting is not punishment, it is management. But the effect on the officer is the same. They are moved out of the roles where they are most capable and into roles where their presence is least disruptive. The cost of administrative burial is the slow death of expertise. Officers who once commanded starships, who once made first contact with alien species, who once navigated spatial anomalies and negotiated treaties, are reduced to reviewing supply manifests and approving duty rosters. The knowledge they carry becomes irrelevant. The instincts they developed atrophy. And because the work is framed as necessary, because Starfleet genuinely requires administrative support to function, the officer has no basis to refuse the assignment. They are serving, they are contributing. The fact that they are being wasted is not a recognized category of harm within the personnel system. Then there are the assignments, where the moral cost is not neglect but corruption. Starfleet intelligence operates in the shadows of Federation policy, conducting surveillance, running covert operations, and managing information flows that the public never sees. Officers assigned to intelligence roles often find themselves in positions where the ideals Starfleet claims to represent are quietly discarded in favor of strategic necessity. These officers do not carry phasers into battle. They do not explore strange new worlds. They monitor communications, recruit informants, manipulate political movements, and occasionally authorize actions that would be classified as war crimes if conducted openly. The work is justified as necessary for Federation security. The officers performing it are expected to internalize that justification and continue without oversight, without external validation, and without the ability to discuss what they have done. The assignment is not forced in the sense of imprisonment. Officers are selected for intelligence work based on aptitude, psychological profile, and operational need. But once assigned, the role becomes a trap. The knowledge the officer gains cannot be shared. The actions they take cannot be disclosed. The moral compromises they make cannot be undone. Over time, the officer becomes separated from the broader Starfleet community. They cannot speak freely with former colleagues. They cannot return to standard postings without extensive debriefing and psychological evaluation. And because the work they perform is classified, they have no way to process the ethical weight of what they have done. The assignment consumes them, not through isolation, not through irrelevance, through moral erosion. The officer continues to serve, but the person they were when they accepted the assignment no longer exists. Section 31 represents the extreme end of this mechanism. While officially disavowed by Starfleet, Section 31 operates with enough autonomy and enough access to resources that its existence is tolerated as a strategic asset. Officers recruited into Section 31 are not reassigned in the traditional sense. They are absorbed, their records are altered or expunged, their contact with former colleagues is severed, and the operations they conduct exist outside the ethical framework Starfleet claims to uphold. In Deep Space Nine, Dr. Julian Bashir's encounters with Section 31 reveal how the organization recruits officers who possess skills it requires and then manipulates them into complicity through strategic isolation, moral blackmail, and the weaponization of loyalty. Bashir resists. But the episodes make clear that many officers do not. They are brought into Section 31's operations and never leave, not because they are imprisoned. Because they cannot reconcile what they have done with the uniform they still wear, the assignment becomes their identity. And that identity is incompatible with reintegration into standard Starfleet service. The psychological cost of intelligence work is not trauma in the traditional sense. It is dissonance. The officer is told they are defending the Federation. They are given orders that require them to betray allies, manipulate populations, and authorize violence against non-combatants. And they are expected to carry out those orders without question because the alternative is systemic failure. Over time, the officer internalizes the logic. They begin to see the galaxy through the lens of threat assessment and strategic advantage. They stop thinking in terms of exploration or diplomacy. They think in terms of control. And once that shift is complete, the officer is no longer capable of returning to the ideals that brought them into Starfleet in the first place. The assignment has rewritten them. There is a fourth category: the assignments that do not isolate, do not bury, and do not corrupt, but instead lock the officer into a role where failure is inevitable and where success is invisible. Starfleet assigns officers to manage experimental technologies, prototype vessels, and high-risk research initiatives that exist on the edge of what the Federation understands. These assignments are framed as opportunities. The officer is told they will contribute to the advancement of science, that their work will shape the future of Starfleet, that they are part of something larger than themselves. The reality is that these assignments are often designed to contain projects that Command does not fully support, that political factions within the Federation want to see fail, or that carry risks so significant that no senior officer is willing to attach their name to the outcome. The officer assigned to manage the project becomes the scapegoat. If the project succeeds, credit flows upward to the admirals who authorized it. If it fails, blame flows downward to the officer who managed it. The assignment is not a career opportunity. It is a liability trap. The Excelsior-class development program offers a case study in this dynamic. The USS Excelsior, introduced in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, is presented as the future of Starfleet's fleet. The ship is equipped with transwarp drive technology intended to surpass warp propulsion in speed and efficiency. Captain Styles is assigned to command the vessel during its initial trials. On screen, Styles is depicted as arrogant and dismissive. But beneath that characterization lies a strategic reality. Styles is assigned to a prototype vessel carrying experimental technology that Starfleet has invested enormous resources into developing. If transwarp drive succeeds, Styles becomes a footnote in the Admiral's achievement. If it fails, Styles becomes the officer who could not make it work. The transwarp experiment does fail. The technology is later abandoned, and Styles' career is quietly sidelined. He does not command a Constitution-class vessel. He does not receive a high-profile posting. He is moved into roles where his failure with the Excelsior can be contained. The assignment was never about his success. It was about managing institutional risk. The cost of these experimental postings is reputational destruction. The officer is associated with failure regardless of whether that failure was within their control. And because Starfleet's culture valorizes success, because promotions and future assignments are determined by performance metrics, the officer's career trajectory is permanently altered. They are not discharged, They are not formally punished, but they are marked, and that mark follows them through every subsequent assignment. The system does not need to remove them. It simply ensures they never rise above the level where their failure occurred. The mechanism is identical across all 4 categories. Isolation, irrelevance, corruption, and reputational destruction achieve the same outcome. The officer remains in service. The uniform remains on their body. But the person inside the uniform is erased, replaced by a function that Starfleet can sustain indefinitely, without requiring consent, without offering escape, and without acknowledging the cost. And the system is self-reinforcing. Once an officer is reassigned to one of these roles, returning to standard duty becomes nearly impossible. The skills required for exploration, diplomacy, or command are not maintained in isolation postings. Administrative roles, intelligence work, or experimental assignments. The social networks that enable career advancement erode. The reputation necessary to secure high-profile postings is damaged, and the psychological changes induced by the assignment make the officer unsuitable for reintegration. Starfleet's personnel system does not recognize these factors as barriers. It treats each assignment as equivalent service. The officer's record shows continued duty. The reality is that they have been removed from the pathways that lead to meaningful command. The assignments are not randomly distributed. Starfleet uses them strategically. Officers who ask too many questions, who refuse orders that conflict with their principles, who witness actions that command cannot afford to have disclosed, or who simply become inconvenient, are reassigned to roles where their influence is neutralized. The official justification is always operational necessity. The assignment is framed as essential to Starfleet's mission, but the outcome is consistent. The officer is removed from positions of authority, placed in roles where oversight is minimal, and left to serve indefinitely without the possibility of meaningful change. The clearest example of this dynamic occurs in Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Captain James T. Kirk and Dr. Leonard McCoy are convicted of assassinating Klingon Chancellor Gorkon and sentenced to life imprisonment on Rura Penthe, a penal colony where survival is measured in months. The conviction is a frame. The trial is a political operation designed to eliminate Kirk as a threat to the conspiracy working to prevent Federation Klingon peace. But the mechanism Starfleet uses to manage Kirk before the trial reveals how reassignment functions as institutional control. Kirk is assigned to escort Gorkon to the peace conference despite his well-documented hostility toward the Klingon Empire. The assignment is framed as an honor. In reality, it is a setup. Kirk's presence ensures that any incident can be blamed on his prejudice, on his inability to accept the changing political landscape. The conspiracy uses this predictability to frame him for murder. And Starfleet's institutional mechanisms allow the frame to proceed because Kirk has already been categorized as a problem. Kirk escapes Rura Penthe. Most officers do not. Not because they are imprisoned on penal colonies, but because the assignments they are given function as institutional Rura Penthes. The officer is placed in a role where escape is impossible, where the conditions are designed to be endured rather than overcome, and where the system sustains them just enough to keep them functioning. They are not killed, they are preserved, and that preservation is worse. The Federation does not execute its own because execution is final. It creates closure. It ends the relationship between the institution and the individual. But reassignment does not end anything. It extends service indefinitely. It keeps the officer in uniform, keeps them logged in the personnel system, and keeps them performing functions that the Federation requires. The officer's suffering is invisible, their erosion is not measured, and because they are still alive, still in service, the system can claim it is treating them humanely. The fact that their humanity has been systematically extracted is not a metric Starfleet tracks. Consider the officers assigned to deep space relay stations positioned along the edge of explored space. These stations maintain subspace communication networks that allow starships to remain in contact with Starfleet command across vast distances. The work is critical. The stations are automated to a significant degree, but they require periodic maintenance, system updates, and oversight to ensure the network remains functional. Officers assigned to these stations often serve alone or with one or two others. Their duties are technical, repetitive, and isolated from broader Starfleet operations. Communication with the outside world occurs through scheduled reports and occasional supply runs. The posting is framed as a temporary rotation. In practice, it often extends for years. The officer stationed at a relay outpost cannot leave without authorization. The station must remain staffed. Replacements are scheduled based on Starfleet's logistical priorities, not the officer's needs. If a replacement is delayed due to resource constraints, political shifts, or operational demands elsewhere, the officer simply continues. And because the work they perform is essential, because the network they maintain supports vessels across multiple sectors, the officer has no grounds to refuse the extension. They are serving. They are needed. The fact that they are being slowly erased by the isolation and monotony of the assignment is not something the personnel system is designed to address. The psychological impact is documented in several episodes. In the Next Generation episode, The Ensigns of Command, the Enterprise D encounters a human colony that has been isolated for decades. The colonists have adapted to their environment, but their adaptation has come at the cost of their connection to the Federation. They no longer see themselves as part of the larger community. They have become insular, resistant to change, and psychologically separated from the ideals they once shared. The colony is not a Starfleet posting, but the mechanism is identical. Isolation transforms identity. Over time, the individual becomes incapable of reintegration. The assignment does not need to be permanent to achieve this outcome. It simply needs to last long enough. There is a deeper pattern beneath these examples. Starfleet maintains its reputation as an exploratory and diplomatic service by ensuring that the roles which contradict that reputation remain invisible. The officers assigned to monitoring stations, administrative hubs, intelligence operations, and experimental programs do not appear in the official narratives. They are not featured in recruitment materials. Their service is not celebrated. They are the infrastructure that allows the heroes to exist. And because that infrastructure is essential, because the Federation cannot function without it, the officers who staff it are treated as renewable resources. Their needs are secondary to the system's operational requirements. Their suffering is acceptable as long as the system continues to function. The Admiralty understands this. They manage it deliberately. When an officer becomes problematic, when their questions attract the wrong kind of attention, when their integrity threatens to expose contradictions Starfleet cannot afford to acknowledge, reassignment offers a clean solution. The officer is not court-martialed. They are not discharged in disgrace. They are simply moved, and the roles they are moved into ensure that their influence, their voice, and their ability to disrupt the system are neutralized. The process is quiet, procedural, and entirely within the bounds of Starfleet's personnel regulations. It leaves no record of punishment, it creates no martyrs. It simply removes the problem by placing it somewhere the system can sustain it indefinitely. Admiral Nora Satie's investigation into a suspected conspiracy aboard the Enterprise D in the Next Generation episode, The Drumhead, reveals how Starfleet manages officers whose zeal becomes inconvenient. Satie is a decorated officer with a long history of successful investigations, but her pursuit of a conspiracy that does not exist, her willingness to destroy the careers of innocent officers in the name of security, and her increasing detachment from the principles Starfleet claims to uphold make her a liability. Captain Jean-Luc Picard confronts her publicly, exposing the authoritarian logic driving her investigation. Satie's career does not end with formal punishment. It ends with quiet reassignment. She is removed from active investigations, placed in roles where her influence is contained and her legacy is quietly redefined. The system does not need to destroy her. It simply needs to ensure she cannot do further damage. And reassignment achieves that outcome without the political cost of a public trial. The method is consistent. Identify the officer who has become inconvenient. Find a role that requires their technical skills, but removes their decision-making authority. Frame the reassignment as operational necessity. And wait. The officer will either adapt to the new role, at which point they cease to be a problem, or they will resign, at which point they are no longer Starfleet's responsibility. Either outcome serves the system's needs. The officer's well-being is irrelevant. This is not malice. It is design. Starfleet operates across hundreds of worlds, manages thousands of vessels, and coordinates millions of personnel. The institution cannot afford to be derailed by individual officers whose principles conflict with strategic necessity. It cannot allow personal integrity to override operational requirements, and it cannot permit dissent to spread unchecked through the ranks. Reassignment is the tool Starfleet uses to manage these tensions without resorting to authoritarian measures that would contradict its public values. The officer is not silenced. They are simply moved to a position where their voice cannot be heard. The distinction is important. It allows Starfleet to maintain its reputation while ensuring that internal dissent is contained. The mechanism functions because most officers never recognize it. They see reassignment as a normal part of career progression. They accept the framing that every posting is essential, that every role serves the Federation's mission. And in many cases, that framing is accurate. The majority of reassignments are routine, necessary, and appropriate. But embedded within that routine are the assignments designed to neutralize, to isolate, to erode. And because those assignments use the same procedural language, the same personnel forms, the same logistical structures as routine postings, they are nearly impossible to distinguish until the officer is already locked in. The late-game clincher is this: Starfleet does not need to change its policies to make these assignments more humane, because the assignments are working exactly as designed. The officers assigned to isolation postings continue to maintain the monitoring networks. The officers buried in administrative roles continue to process the reports. The officers absorbed into intelligence continue to conduct the operations. And the officers managing experimental programs continue to take the blame when those programs fail. The system extracts function from each of them without requiring their consent, without offering them escape, and without acknowledging the cost. The Federation's ideals are preserved because the officers who contradict those ideals are moved into roles where their existence does not challenge the narrative. The explorers, the diplomats, the heroes remain visible. The infrastructure remains hidden. And the officers who staff that infrastructure are quietly consumed. What makes these assignments worse than death is not the absence of danger. It is the absence of resolution. Death ends service. These assignments extend it indefinitely. The officer remains alive, remains in uniform, remains logged in the personnel system. But the conditions of their service make it impossible to leave, impossible to grow, and impossible to reconcile what the uniform represents with what the assignment demands. Over time, the officer stops being a person. They become a function, and that function persists long after the individual inside it has been erased. The broader truth revealed is that Starfleet's idealism is sustained by a foundation of roles designed to strip autonomy, identity, and moral clarity from the officers assigned to them. The Federation does not execute its own because execution creates martyrs, invites scrutiny, and contradicts the values it claims to uphold. Reassignment achieves the same outcome without any of those costs. It is quiet, procedural, and entirely legal. It removes the officer from positions of influence, places them in roles where their presence is sustainable but their voice is silenced, and ensures that the system can continue operating without disruption. The officer's suffering is invisible, their erosion is not measured, and because they are still alive, still in service, Starfleet can claim it has treated them with dignity and respect. The mechanism is not a flaw, it is a feature. It is how the Federation manages the contradiction between its ideals and its operational requirements. It is how Starfleet ensures that the officers who become inconvenient, unreliable, or morally problematic are removed from the narrative without being removed from service. And it is how the institution preserves itself across centuries of exploration, war, and political upheaval. The cost is measured in the officers who are consumed by the system, whose lives are extended, but whose humanity is quietly extinguished. They remain in uniform, they remain on duty, but the person who first accepted that uniform is gone. And Starfleet continues without them, confident that the roles they fill will always find new officers willing to serve, unaware of what that service will eventually cost. The Starfleet job worse than death is not a single posting. It is the category of assignments designed to sustain the body while erasing the person inside it. And the Federation relies on those assignments to function.